Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping ourselves into a machine that, well, it perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of German wartime engineering. The Sd.Kfz 222 Armored Reconnaissance Car.
It really is a fascinating piece of kit, almost tragic in a way. We're looking at a vehicle designed for speed, agility, stealth, the absolute embodiment of that blitzkrieg idea.
Right.
But underneath all that elegance and perceived efficiency, the Sd.Kfz 222 harbored this fundamental deadly secret, a secret that ultimately betrayed pretty much every crew that trusted it. That's why we're calling this one paper armor.
Paper armor, that really hits it. And the story, it kind of begins with this truly catastrophic compromise, the sheer drama of its failure, maybe best summed up by this one test deep in the North African theater. We almost have to start right there.
Yeah, let's do that. Picture this. 1941, the scorching Libyan desert, not far from Tobruk. The Allies have captured one of these German scout cars, right? And their engineers are getting ready to test its resilience, see what it's really made of.
And what's so jarring, so revealing about this moment is that they weren't rolling out the big guns. No heavy anti-tank cannons, no specialized high-velocity stuff.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
They were using something utterly standard issue, the weapon that basically every Allied infantryman carried.
That's the absolute core of the revelation, isn't it? They took a standard British Lee-Enfield rifle, okay?
Yeah.
Granted, it was loaded with armor-piercing rounds, AP rounds.
Sure, AP rounds, but still just a rifle.
Exactly. And they fired it pretty much point blank at the steel hull of this captured 222, and the result, it wasn't a dent, it wasn't a ricochet.
No, the bullet pierced that 8mm steel plate clean through, just punched a hole right through it.
Wow.
And the sources we have, the reports from those Allied tests, they are brutally clear. They describe the German armor as being exposed as fragile, almost like tin.
Tin. Imagine hearing that. The immediate intelligence gain for the Allies must have been huge, just immense.
Think about it. This vehicle, this symbol of German speed that had zipped across Europe, spearheading those huge victories in 39 and 40, suddenly it's vulnerable to a standard rifle shot, a rifle that every single infantryman carried.
It just flips the script entirely on the vehicle's survivability.
So, okay, our mission today, it feels pretty ambitious but necessary. We need to unpack this whole story. How did a vehicle designed by, frankly, some of the most sophisticated engineers in the world, hailed as this triumph of German mobility, how did it end up so fatally flawed, this idea of paper armor?
Exactly. And maybe more broadly, what does the rise and, well, the catastrophic fall of the Sd.Kfz 222 tell us about the long-term price of wartime compromise? Especially, and this is key, when that compromise is forced not by battlefield necessity, but by political and legal limitations from years before.
Right. That pre-war context is crucial. Okay, let's unpack this by starting right there at the source of the problem. The political context of the early 1930s. This is really where the seed of the 222's vulnerability was planted, wasn't it? Long before World War II was even really on the horizon. Absolutely. You have to remember the environment back then. Germany was still operating under the crippling shadow of the Treaty of Versailles, after the Great War. That treaty was meticulously designed, really, to prevent Germany from ever mounting a serious offensive war again.
And it wasn't just about limiting troop numbers, right? The restrictions on hardware were specific.
Oh, incredibly specific and targeted. Germany was explicitly forbidden from possessing or developing tanks, any large armored fighting vehicles, or really any heavy mechanized forces that could be used for, well, offensive warfare.
So a panzer troop was completely out of the question, officially.
Officially, yes. But the German general staff, they were determined to rebuild their military capabilities in secret, or at least under the radar. And this required finding loopholes, strategic misdirection, basically. Playing with definitions.
So they couldn't build something they called a tank, but the treaty, maybe it was a bit vague or silent on certain other types of vehicles, and that allowed them to sort of focus on a niche area.
Precisely. That was the loophole. They poured resources into what they termed, quite carefully, reconnaissance vehicle development.
Ah, reconnaissance. This sounds harmless enough.
Exactly. The official justification was, light, fast scouting cars, good for intelligence gathering, maybe internal policing duties, benign stuff. But the real goal, the hidden agenda, was quietly to develop the automotive tech, the armored concepts, the industrial base for the future panzer divisions that were strictly forbidden by Versailles.
Clever. And this is the environment, the sort of careful tiptoeing around the rules, that gives birth to the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 222, the special purpose vehicle 222. And the design brief itself, it had to reflect this political reality, right? Prioritizing agility and speed above all else.
Absolutely. It had to look like a scout car, The engineering was led by some really top-tier firms, Horch Auto Union, part of that legendary German automotive pedigree that eventually becomes Audi.
So serious engineers.
Well, yeah, the best. But they were tasked with a really difficult constraint. Build something durable enough to carry, some armor and a decent weapon, but critically, light enough and fast enough to convincingly qualify as just a scout car, under the watchful eyes of the Allied monitoring commissions set up by Versailles.
It had to pass the smell test, basically.
A call.
And what were the key specifications that came out of this speed first, stay light philosophy?
Well, if you look at the vehicle specs, they really tell the whole story. The 222 weighed just over 4 tons. Now, to put that in context, that is incredibly light for any armored vehicle. It's roughly the weight of, say, a modern heavy-duty pickup truck.
Wow. But armed with a cannon.
Right, but armed with a cannon. It was built with a pretty robust four-wheel drive system, which was crucial for off-road stuff, and it could hit speeds approaching 80 kilometers per hour on roads, nearly 50 miles per hour. That was seriously fast at the time.
And that speed, that was intended as its primary defense, wasn't it? Run away, don't stand and fight.
Exactly. It was about escaping danger, not enduring it. The whole concept relied on not getting hit in the first place.
It also had that really distinctive look, didn't it? A relatively simple chassis, boxy hull, and then that quite unique open-topped turret on top.
Yeah, the open turret is a key feature. Inside that turret was usually a 20-millimeter autocannon, typically the KWK-30 or later the KWK-38. Now, for a scout car that size, that 20-millimeter cannon was actually quite significant armament.
It packed a punch.
Against the right targets, yes. It gave the 222 excellent firepower against infantry, unarmored trucks, machine gun nests, that kind of thing. Soft targets, had a high rate of fire, could use high explosive shells pretty effectively. But, and this is a big but, against any actual armored target, like another armored car or certainly a tank, its penetration capability was severely limited.
So it was designed to clear a path, suppress infantry, observe, but definitely not to get into a serious fight with enemy armor.
Absolutely not. That was not its role. And the armor itself. You mentioned the boxy hull. It was mostly vertical plating, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which we know is easier to manufacture, but generally less effective than sloped armor.
Right. Sloping gives you more effective thickness and encourages ricochets. Vertical plates are just easier targets.
Exactly. And the decision to use mostly vertical plates was probably a mix of pragmatism, ease of production, and necessity, again tied to keeping the weight down. The maximum armor thickness was just 8 millimeters.
8 millimeters? That sounds incredibly thin.
It was incredibly thin. 8 millimeters of roll homogeneous armor, RHA, and that was mainly on the frontal surfaces. It got even thinner on the sides and rear. Now, 8 millimeters was considered just about sufficient back then to stop standard pistol rounds, maybe rifle ball ammunition fired from a distance, or shell fragments. That was the kind of threat they expected a late scout car might encounter.
So sufficient for maybe policing duties or fighting partisans, but not for a real battlefield with dedicated anti-armor weapons.
Precisely. It was never, ever intended to withstand dedicated anti-tank rounds, or even the common armor-piercing rifle ammunition that pretty much all armies quickly developed and fielded in large numbers.
Which brings us back to this core idea. What's fascinating here, and maybe tragic, is that the deadly calculation wasn't really an engineering failure in the sense that they couldn't have designed thicker armor if they'd wanted to.
No, they had the know-how.
The deadly calculation was fundamentally political, wasn't it? Tied directly back to Versailles. If they had designed the 222 with, say, 15 millimeter or 20 millimeters of armor enough to stop those AP rifle rounds, it would have become too heavy for that fast, light chassis they needed.
Correct. It would have slowed down, stressed the engine, and suspension.
And more importantly, perhaps critically for the pre-war context, a heavier, better armored vehicle would have clearly fallen outside the acceptable definition of a mere reconnaissance vehicle allowed by the treaty. It would have screamed light tank, basically.
That's the absolute critical insight here. The 222 was designed brilliantly to cheat a treaty, to look agile, light, non-threatening on paper. And that foundational decision, forced by the political limitations imposed back in 1919, absolutely guaranteed that the crews operating that vehicle years later, in the heat of battle, would be tragically vulnerable when they faced the realities of modern mechanized warfare.
The design was optimized for legal compliance, you could say, not necessarily for maximum combat survivability against the threats it would actually face.
Exactly. A compromise made in peacetime, paid for in wartime.
Yeah. Okay, so that sets the stage for its inherent weakness. Let's move on to its operational life, because initially it didn't seem weak at all. We now enter what you might call the glory days for the Sd.Kfz 222. When war finally breaks out in 1939, this vehicle is ready And for a while, it looked like a total triumph.
Oh, absolutely. For those initial campaigns, the 222 was, well, it felt like the perfect tool for the job. When Germany invaded Poland in September 39, it demonstrated exactly what it was designed to do. High-speed scouting, pushing miles ahead of the main panzer columns.
Being the tip of the spear.
Precisely. Providing this continuous stream of up-to-the-minute intelligence back to the commanders. Where the enemy? Where the defense is weak? Where can we punch through?
It perfectly embodied that whole idea of Bewegungskrieg, that war of movement that really defined the Blitzkrieg concept. It wasn't supposed to slug it out in the main battle. It was the sensor that guided the fist of the panzers.
And it absolutely excelled at that role. By 1940, during the campaign in France and the Low Countries, the 222 had really cemented its place. It was the backbone of the German reconnaissance battalions, the Aufklärungsabteilungen.
And the crew structure supported this intelligence role, right? Driver, radio operator, commander, gunner.
Yeah, typically three men. You had the driver up front, often a radio operator next to him who might also handle a whole machine gun on some models, and then the commander, who also acted as the gunner, up in that open turret trying to see everything.
The radio aspect is key here, too. Weren't there dedicated radio variants like the Sd.Kfz 223 with those big distinctive frame antennas on top? They were essentially moving communication hubs.
That's absolutely right. The ability of the 222, especially those radio variants, to instantly report enemy locations, troop concentrations, weak points, it was revolutionary for the time. They weren't just scouting villages and coming back later with a report. They were reporting in real time via radio.
Which allowed those panzer commanders, people like Guderian, to make decisions on the fly, execute those rapid, decisive maneuvers that just stunned the French and British forces.
Completely. The 222 genuinely earned its title back then as the eyes and ears of the Panzer Corps because it provided the timely, actionable data required for that lightning advance. It made Blitzkrieg possible in many ways.
And you can imagine the enthusiasm from the field units must have been immense at this stage.
Oh, overwhelmingly positive from everything we read. The soldiers, the crews, they appreciated the speed. That four-wheel drive gave it excellent mobility, especially on the European road networks, and even across reasonably firm fields and terrain. Officers, they saw undeniable success. The strategy was working, the vehicle was performing exactly as designed.
And that 20-millimeter autocannon, while light against tanks, was probably more than enough for the kind of resistance they were initially encountering from reconnaissance units or rear area troops.
Yeah, absolutely. It could handle minor resistance, clear roadblocks, suppress infantry positions effectively enough for its scouting role. From their perspective in 1939 and 1940, the vehicle seemed to have the right balance.
But, and there's always a but in these stories, if we pause here, reflect on this initial success, what really stands out is that this period, this glorious success, it was fundamentally deceptive, wasn't it?
Completely deceptive. The first battlefields, Poland, France, they essentially masked the inherent design flaw, that paper armor. Why? Because the opposition, while certainly brave, often lacked the kind of modern synchronized anti-tank defense network that would appear later in the war.
They didn't have the right tools everywhere, or maybe the doctrine wasn't there yet to specifically target these fast movers.
A bit of both. They lacked the means, meaning widespread issue of effective armor-piercing ammunition for standard rifles and machine guns in sufficient numbers, or they lacked the coordinated method to really exploit the 222's thin skin effectively and consistently. If you don't fight a fully equipped and tactically adapted enemy, you never truly test your own limitations, do you?
No, you get a false sense of security. So the 222 was essentially operating within this kind of artificial protective bubble, created by its speed, the element of surprise, and the enemy's initial unpreparedness.
Exactly. And the moment the Allies adapted, the moment they started fielding readily available weapons capable of exploiting that 8-millimeter armor,
Yeah.
well, that bubble was going to burst spectacularly.
And the confidence that must have built up during this period, this belief among the crews and commanders that speed and agility really did compensate for thin armor, that probably only magnified the shock when things started to go wrong.
It absolutely did. They mistook initial operational success, which was real, for fundamental design soundness, which was an illusion.
Yeah.
And that distinction, as we'll see, proved utterly fatal for many crews.
Right. And that devastating realization, that moment the bubble burst, really came in 1941. The war moves out of the relatively green, temperate forests and roads of Europe and slams into the scorching, unforgiving, and incredibly vast environments of the North African campaign. This is where the battlefield changes everything for the Sd.Kfz 222.
North Africa was a trial by fire. I mean, that literally and figuratively. It wasn't just about facing, tougher, more experienced British and Commonwealth opposition, although that was part of it. It was about confronting the unique demands of long-range desert warfare.
Which requires what? Different things than European warfare.
Totally different demands. Extreme durability, resilience against constant heat and sand, much longer operational ranges, and resistance to environmental breakdown. And the poor 222, well, it failed pretty dramatically on almost all those fronts.
Okay, let's break down the environmental failures first, because they really highlight how a design optimized, perhaps, for Central Europe could just completely fall apart somewhere else.
Yeah, the environment itself became a major adversary. The first big issue was the engine. The 222 used an air-cooled engine. Now, that choice is often made for simplicity, maybe lighter weight, no need for a radiator and coolant system.
Sounds good in theory.
Sounds good. But in the scorching North African sun, with incredibly high ambient temperatures day after day, air-cooled engines struggle immensely to shed heat. They just can't cool effectively. So what do we see in the reports? Constant overheating,
Which means?
which means frequent, time-consuming, and incredibly dangerous maintenance stops. Often out in the open desert, totally exposed, the exact opposite of what a fast, stealthy scout car should be doing. It becomes a sitting duck just trying to cool down.
And then there's the sand, that fine desert dust, the stuff they sometimes call fesh. It's notorious.
Oh, it was relentless. Absolutely insidious. That fine dust got into everything. It got into the air filtration systems, which were probably not designed for that level of particulate matter, accelerating engine wear dramatically, cylinder scoring, bearing failures.
A maintenance nightmare.
A total nightmare. But maybe even more critically for its role, it got into that open-topped turret.
Ah, right. Exposed commander and gunner.
Exactly. The sources we have describe gunners being essentially blinded by the constant dust. It coated their optics, got into the mechanisms of the 20mm autocannon, forcing crews constantly to stop, clean everything out, try and maintain their weapon under appalling conditions, often while potentially under threat.
Reconnaissance is pretty useless if your primary sensor, the commander's eyes, and the gunner's optics are constantly choked with dust.
Precisely. Your eyes and ears are effectively blinded by the environment itself, even before the enemy shoots at you.
But then the enemy did shoot at them. And this brings us back to the truly catastrophic failure, the one that really validated those Allied training manuals and changed everything. The armor itself, that central flaw, just 8 millimeters thick.
Yeah. And the story of that Tobruk test, the one we mentioned at the start with the Lee Enfield rifle, that becomes the absolute turning point in Allied doctrine regarding the 222.
It was basically a gift of intelligence, wasn't it? Free information on how to kill this thing easily.
An incredible gift.
Yeah.
When those Allied engineers, and again, we have to stress this, used the standard .303 caliber Lee Enfield armor-piercing round, they confirmed empirically that its muzzle velocity and its hardened steel core were more than sufficient to punch straight through that 8 millimeters of RHA at typical combat ranges.
Not even point-blank range was necessarily required.
No, standard combat ranges. And remember, this wasn't some specialized anti-tank rifle round yet. This was standard infantry issue AP ammunition.
Yeah.
Every rifleman, every Bren gunner potentially carried rounds that could defeat this vehicle.
If we compare that, say, contemporary British or American light armored cars, what kind of armor thickness were they typically sporting? Would 8 millimeter have been considered acceptable by Allied standards then?
Generally, no. 8 millimeter RHA was really only considered effective against shell fragments, maybe glancing shots from machine guns or very low caliber or low velocity rifle fire. For comparison, most dedicated light armored cars of that period, even the very light ones, were pushing towards maybe 12 millimeter, even 15 millimeters of frontal armor, specifically to defeat those common AP rifle rounds. The 222 was demonstrably below the expected survivability threshold for that desert battlefield environment.
So the moment those Tobruk test results came in, the intelligence reports must have flown up the chain of command immediately.
Instantly. High priority. The Sd.Kfz 222 went from being this agile, somewhat mysterious threat, something maybe hard to catch, to a known quantity. A high-priority vulnerable target. Its secret was out.
And the tactical shift that followed was pretty remarkable, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Knowledge became the Allies' primary weapon against the 222. Field manuals, recognition guides, training materials, they were quickly updated. Allied troops, right down to the infantry squads, were specifically trained on how to recognize the 222 and, crucially, where its weak spots were.
Aim here, not there.
Exactly. They knew to aim for the flat side panels, where the armor was thinnest and vertical, aim for the rear engine compartment to try and disable it, aim for the lower turret ring, Basically, anywhere the 8 millimeters of protection offered little or no resistance at all to AP rounds.
Which meant that those German crews, who were relying on their speed to maybe avoid contact or quickly disengage, they are now trapped. If they were spotted, even by just a small, well-positioned group of Allied infantry with rifles and maybe a machine gun,
Yeah.
they could be effectively disabled or destroyed. That reconnaissance capability, the whole reason for the vehicle's existence, could be eliminated almost instantly.
The whole risk equation just flipped on its head for them, completely. A reconnaissance vehicle must be able to observe the enemy and then return safely with that information. That's the core mission. But when standard rifle fire becomes potentially lethal, crews inevitably become hesitant. They might pull back too soon, not push forward enough to see what they need to see, or they simply fail to complete their mission because they take casualties.
And the psychological impact. Knowing your armor is effectively paper, as the title says, against the enemy's most basic weapon. That must have been immense.
Devastating. It absolutely crippled the 222's operational value in North Africa, and as we'll see elsewhere too. Confidence in the machine evaporated.
Okay, so the German high command, the engineers back home, they're getting these brutal field reports flooding in, particularly from North Africa, where the losses of these vehicles mounted really rapidly. They knew they had a serious problem on their hands.
Oh, they knew. And they did try to react. They tried desperately to evolve the design, producing new variants or upgrading existing ones throughout its service life, which ran from about 1937 right up to 1943 in various forms.
So there were attempts to fix the armor issue.
Yes, we see variants that clearly attempt to correct the flaw. They incorporate slightly thicker armor plates, particularly in later models, or maybe the 222's immediate cousins, like the Sd.Kfz 221 or 223. These versions were inevitably a bit heavier, a bit more complex, and yes, marginally better protected. Maybe 10 millimeters, perhaps, up to 14.5 millimeters on the very front in the latest iterations.
But only marginally better. It wasn't a fundamental fix.
No, because they ran smack bang into that fundamental roadblock, the one imposed by the original design philosophy, the need to be light and fast.
And that roadblock, as we established earlier, was the chassis itself, right? The underlying structure.
Precisely. That lightweight Horch chassis, which was fantastic for achieving that high speed and agility on roads, it had a severe weight limit. It just wasn't designed to carry much more load. If you tried to significantly thicken the armor, say up-armoring it properly to maybe 50 millimeters, 20 millimeters all around, to reliably defeat those AP rifle rounds, the vehicle would just become too heavy.
And the consequences of being too heavy.
Well, multiple things. It would lose its signature speed and agility, the very reason it existed. You'd see increased mechanical breakdowns due to the excessive strain on the engine, the transmission, the suspension, and ultimately it would just cease to function effectively as a high-speed scout car.
They were well and truly stuck in a paradox, weren't they? They could try to fix the armor, or they could keep the speed, but they simply could not do both with that existing platform.
Exactly. It's that classic engineering challenge, isn't it? The triangle of compromise. Speed, protection, and firepower. They'd initially chosen speed above all else, dictated by those Versailles constraints, and the design just wouldn't tolerate a major correction later on without fundamentally breaking the concept.
And while the engineers back in Germany were wrestling with this, impossible technical limitation, the poor crews on the front lines facing lethal threats every single day, they took matters into their own hands, didn't they?
They absolutely did. This is where we see that universal, almost poignant phenomenon of field improvisation when issued equipment isn't up to the job.
What kinds of things were they doing?
It's heartbreaking, really, because it's such clear evidence of a flawed design. You see photos, you read accounts, crews started welding on extra steel plates, anything they could scavenge from derelict trucks, maybe other knocked-out vehicles. They hung sandbags over the most vulnerable areas, particularly those flat side panels.
Trying to add some kind of standoff protection or extra mass.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you even see photographs of them bolting spare road wheels or sections of tank track onto the hull. Anything, really, for some kind of perceived extra protection.
And what was the actual practical effectiveness of these desperate additions? Did welding on a bit of scrap metal or hanging sandbags really help against, say, an AP rifle round or heavy machine gun?
Honestly, practically zero. Or minimal. Minimal at best. I mean, maybe adding an extra layer of thin steel or some sandbags might prematurely detonate a very low-velocity hollow charge round, perhaps. But against a dedicated kinetic energy penetrator, like an AP rifle round or a high-velocity heavy machine gun round, these modifications provided little more than, well, false hope. That's the term the sources often use.
False hope. And possibly detrimental in other ways.
Quite possibly. These improvisations often added significant weight, which, as we discussed, the chassis wasn't designed for. This could further strain the engine, reduce mobility, maybe interfere with engine cooling, or the driver's visibility.
Hmm.
So, ironically, these attempts to improve protection could actually degrade the vehicle's only real defense, its mobility.
A truly desperate situation for the crews. And this already bad situation was only amplified, wasn't it, when the 222 was deployed on the Eastern Front? That introduced an entirely new level of environmental and tactical nightmares, making the vehicle almost unusable in many situations.
Oh, the conditions in Russia were utterly brutal, just orders of magnitude worse than North Africa in some ways. You had the infamous Russian mud seasons, the Rasputitsa, where everything just turned into an impassable quagmire, and then the deep winter snows.
How did the 222 cope with that terrain?
Terribly. Its light 4-ton chassis and relatively narrow tires were completely ill-suited for that vast, incredibly difficult terrain. While it might have been capable of 80 kph on paved German roads, it was often completely stuck, bogged down, immobile in the Russian mud or snow. A scout car that can't move is worse than useless.
And the threat level there, it escalated way beyond just British Lee-Enfields firing AP rounds, right?
Terrifyingly so. The Soviets deployed huge numbers of dedicated anti-tank rifles, weapons like the PTRD and the PTRS. These fired high-velocity 14.5mm rounds, heavy caliber, high speed,
Designed specifically to do what?
designed specifically to defeat light armor, exactly like the 8mm plate on the Sd.Kfz 222. These Soviet anti-tank rifles could reliably destroy a 222 from hundreds of meters away, with relative ease.
So, a reconnaissance vehicle, whose job is to get close enough to see the enemy, suddenly faces heavy anti-tank rifle fire capable of knocking it out from long range.
It becomes utterly obsolete in that role, suicidal almost. The consequence was predictable and grim. German reconnaissance units on the Eastern Front, the ones still equipped with the 222, suffered incredibly heavy casualties, both in terms of lost equipment and lost manpower, experienced crews.
So the vehicle that was once the proud eye of the Wehrmacht
Was effectively blinded because its inherent fragility, that paper armor, meant that getting close enough to the enemy to actually perform meaningful observation was simply too dangerous to achieve reliably anymore. Its time as a frontline scout was well and truly over by 1942-43 on the Eastern Front.
It's fascinating, though. As the 222 was fading from frontline relevance for the Germans, struggling with these crippling flaws, there's this irony that its conceptual brilliance, the good parts of the design, actually inspired its enemies.
This is a tremendous piece of historical irony, isn't it? While the German command was desperately debating how to replace the inadequate 222, the Soviets were capturing examples of it, running their own extensive tests.
Learning from it.
Absolutely. Taking meticulous notes. Not on the armor, obviously they knew that was terrible, but they were studying the vehicle's overall structural layout, its compact design, and especially its high mobility features, that four-wheel drive system.
And that direct influence, that study of captured 222s, resulted in one of the most successful and widely produced light Soviet armored cars of the entire war, didn't it? The BA-64.
The BA-64 is arguably the 222's spiritual successor, but crucially, improved where it mattered most. The Soviets clearly took the central concept, a light, high-speed, four-wheel drive scout car, and implemented critical fixes based directly on the 222's failures.
Specifically the armor.
Specifically the armor layout, yes. They learned from the 222's mistake of using thin vertical plates. The BA-64 incorporated heavily sloped armor all around.
And why was that sloped armor such a significant upgrade, even if the thickness wasn't vastly greater?
Sloping the armor plates does two crucial things. First, it dramatically increases the effective thickness of the armor relative to the line of sight of an incoming projectile. An 8mm plate sloped back at 60 degrees offers much more resistance than an 8mm vertical plate. Second, the slope significantly increases the chance of a bullet or shell simply deflecting or ricocheting off harmlessly.
So better protection without necessarily adding huge amounts of weight.
Exactly. The BA-64's armor was technically only about 4 to 10 millimeters thick in most places, sometimes up to 15 millimeters. Not hugely thicker than the 222 in raw terms, but because of its very clever, heavy sloping, it offered far superior protection, equivalent to much thicker vertical plating, especially against the small arms and rifle fire that had doomed the 222.
And the Soviets probably learned lessons about reliability in harsh conditions, too.
Definitely. They also learned about environmental robustness. The BA-64 was designed to be more reliable, simpler to maintain in the harsh Russian conditions, and it often utilized larger, wider tires for much better off-road traction in mud and snow compared to the 222. They basically took the good ideas of the 222 speed, agility, 4x4, and fixed the bad ones, armor, reliability, terrain handling.
Meanwhile, back in Germany, they finally realized that modifying the 222 just wasn't going to cut it. They needed a totally new platform, right? Which eventually led to the introduction of the much more capable Sd.Kfz 234 series, often nicknamed the Puma, starting around 1943.
Yes, the Puma really represents the fundamental shift in German armored reconnaissance doctrine, a direct reaction to all the painful lessons learned from the failings of the 222. If the 222 was primarily designed for speed and stealth under treaty limitations, the Puma was designed from the outset for survivability and offensive capability.
A completely different philosophy.
A completely different beast altogether. It was larger, substantially heavier, weighing around 11 to 12 tons, so nearly 3 times the weight of the 222. It featured genuine, properly sloped 30mm frontal armor, which was proof against most Allied light anti-tank weapons of the time. And critically, it carried a far more powerful gun, typically a long-barreled 50mm cannon in the most famous Puma variant.
So the Puma could actually defend itself, even engage enemy light tanks or armored cars if necessary, whereas the 222 was really supposed to just run away from any serious threat.
Exactly. The 234 series was conceived as a heavy reconnaissance vehicle in reality, a true wheeled armored fighting vehicle. It corrected pretty much all the shortcomings of the 222 in terms of firepower, protection, and battlefield durability. Technologically, it was superior in almost every single way, a very capable machine.
But if we zoom out again, look at the broader strategic context. Despite how superior the Puma was, it was being introduced into a war that Germany was already definitively losing by 1943-44.
And that's the ultimate strategic tragedy, isn't it? By the time the Puma started arriving in significant numbers, the tide had well and truly turned. No matter how much they improved individual vehicle designs, and the Germans produced some technically brilliant machines late in the war, they simply could not match the overwhelming industrial scale and efficiency of Allied production, particularly the Americans and the Soviets. Nor could they halt the combined, relentless strategic advances of the Soviet forces in the East and the Western Allies after D-Day.
So the Sd.Kfz 222 just faded into history.
Pretty much. It was largely relegated to secondary roles, maybe anti-partisan duties in occupied territories, training, or handed off to allies. And even the formidable Puma, arriving too late and in too few numbers, couldn't fundamentally change the strategic outcome. It was a great vehicle on a losing side.
Which brings us, I think, to our final judgment on the Sd.Kfz 222. This vehicle really stands today as perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale, doesn't it? A story about the real, tangible cost of design compromises, especially when those compromises are forced by non-combat factors like pre-war politics.
It's a really profound story of unintended bloody consequences when you think about it. The engineers, back in the early 30s, they were brilliant in their own way. They solved the political problem they were given. They designed a vehicle that cleverly defied the spirit, if not the exact letter, of the Treaty of Versailles through its lightweight, high-speed profile. It ticked the boxes.
Right.
But years later, it was the crews, the young soldiers on the front lines in Poland, France, North Africa, Russia. They were the ones who paid the fatal price for that initial political compromise. They were sent into battle, trusting a machine that looked advanced, looked fast and efficient, but was fundamentally dangerously compromised in its ability to protect them. Magnificent in theory, perhaps, but fatally flawed in the harsh reality of combat.
The sources we looked at, they essentially conclude that the 222 embodied both the brilliance and simultaneously the blindness of some German war design. Technically magnificent in certain aspects, speed, agility, the concept, but ultimately doomed in practice because it lacked the most basic requirement for an armored vehicle. Survivability against the common weapons carried by the enemy infantrymen it was supposed to scout. That paper armor sealed its fate.
And the story of the Sd.Kfz 222 serves as this incredibly powerful reminder, I think, that technology alone, however clever, cannot win wars. You need that balance, a balance of speed, yes, but also protection, durability, firepower, reliability, and maybe just as crucially, you need operational truth.
What do you mean by operational truth?
The willingness, organizationally, to acknowledge fundamental design flaws when the battlefield exposes them, and then to correct them swiftly and effectively. Even so, that means abandoning an initially elegant or politically expedient concept. The Germans tried to modify the 222, but the core flaw was too deep, tied to that original compromise.
So just to recap the arc for everyone listening, the 222 was conceived essentially to be a stealthy, high-speed defiance of a treaty. It achieved brief, perhaps deceptive glory early in the war, thanks to that speed and the unpreparedness of its opponents. But its inherent fragility, its paper armor, was brutally and tragically exposed by harsh environments like North Africa and, most decisively, by superior, readily available enemy firepower.
And that leads us directly, I think, to the final thought we wanted to leave with you, the listener, today. If you really analyze the story of the Sd.Kfz 222, what you see is a design process where the pursuit of certain qualities, elegance, speed, meeting an arbitrary external requirement, in this case the Versailles limitation, ultimately overrode the basic fundamental need for structural integrity and survivability.
Think about that principle today, maybe stepping outside of military hardware for a moment. How often, maybe in modern business or engineering projects or even rapid software development, do we prioritize the quick and fast solution, the elegant design, the need to meet a tight deadline or a specific budget constraint, the modern equivalent, perhaps, of that Versailles Treaty constraint?
Right. How often do we do that, only to find out later that in our rush, in our focus on one aspect, we've inadvertently built in a fatal vulnerability? That vulnerability might not be 8mm armor plate, but it could be a critical security flaw in software. It could be a hidden structural weakness in a bridge design. It could be a fundamental lack of resilience in a business model that looked great in theory.
The cost of that compromise might not be paid in blood on a battlefield 80 years later, thankfully, but it is almost always paid eventually, paid in consequences and system failures and costly recalls, in damage to reputation, sometimes even in disaster.
The lesson of the Sd.Kfz 222, the lesson of paper armor, it really reminds us that balancing speed, elegance, and requirements with fundamental structural truth and resilience. That's not just good engineering practice. In many fields, it's absolutely essential for survival.
Something profound to definitely mull over until our next deep dive.